Hello, and I hope everybody is doing all right. You'll probably kind of jump right into it like we usually do. Last week we met Marcius's old friend Zeke, who was a fawn, who they have a good relationship, but they have some history between them. And then we also met Caleb, who was a former friend of the previous witch in High Rannoc, who is also the town doctor and also a mage, as Marcius found out. And he gave us a name for the previous witch, not her true name, but one of the aliases she went by, which was Leary. So we will probably just get started. All right. So this will be the start of week 7. I did change things around a little bit on the nameplate and the inventory screen. So here we have Marcius. So our reputation level is 9. So one more case successfully cured and we'll be up to 10. And then once we hit 11, we can start curing slightly more complicated ailments. Our silver is back down to 55 because we did buy ourselves a sickle. And there we can see our familiar briar. And then here on the inventory screen, I changed things up. So we have our reagents on hand. We have those fossil fish scales. We have the moon lotus. And we have the golden guppy venom. And then we have our tools and our items on hand, which now includes the sickle, that protection ring that we picked up in Hero's Hollow, our cauldron, and our mortar and pestle that we have always had. Alright, so we can get going. Pardon me while I take a big old sip of water. May 1st, 7th week of spring. It's rained most of the last few days, anything from a light drizzle to a full downpour in turn. I've spent more time than normal inside the house, Zeke's presence constant in the background, while I finished up with Leary's favorite novel. I have to admit that I am in agreement with the apparent conclusion that she reached, that the novel was set in the area of High Rannoc. But it seemed to be a High Rannoc from a very different time before the town was really established. It seemed to almost to explain the origins of Hero's Hollow. The heroes were called upon to stop a beast that had been rampaging through a new territory of the kingdom. This kingdom was the one that bared the crest of the serpent encircling the rose that the knight hailed from. The other characters were a mix of court-appointed members. The mage and the witch both were in this group along with the knight, and some mercenaries brought in to help, a roguish sort and a thief. It felt very contrived. The first half of the story was a bit of a slog of them sorting out who would journey to take on the beast, and the second half of the story had been filled with notations from Leary. It was this half of the story that seemed to ring so familiar to the area. In the end, the beast had been a Lazar, a dragon, but had only been rampaging because she had been compelled to do so. However, the heroes only discovered this after they had managed to slay her, seemingly where Hero's Hollow lays today. The real beast, after everything, ended up being the knight that she got to know during the journey, The knight had wanted to elevate his status, had wanted some event that would solidify to the king and the entire kingdom that they needed him and would always. It was a drive for power, and so he tapped into a dark source of magic, learned the dragon's true name through manipulation, and used her to strike fear. The others turned on him, and he tried to strike them all down so he'd be the only survivor to tell the tale of how they defeated the dragon. The witch had managed to distract him in their final moments, though, and it gave the rogue the chance she needed to take the knight down. The tale ended there. No resolution on whether the rogue was believed when she returned to the kingdom. No follow-up on how the heir recovered. Just one last notation from Leary. Is it true? I sighed when I read those words and wondered the same thing. There's no denying that Heroes Hollow stood, but there was no history of such a thing in the region occurring. No kingdom that would have birthed the tale. And dragons didn't get as large as the skull that created the entrance to Heroes Hollow. I looked up from my desk to be met with the sight of the narwhal's banner pinned on the wall. I had combed over it nearly thread by thread to try to find some clue, and there was nothing. My mind wandered to Follux, and I thought of taking the banner to him again. I felt like I'd met so many people who knew Leary, but somehow I hadn't learned a single thing about what happened to her from them. They all seemed to fall quiet when I mentioned her. I heard Sieg call for me from the front of the house, a note in his voice that said something was going on, and I closed up the book and tucked it away before heading up to see what it was. Card suit drawn for the patient, club, which means a repeat patient. Card drawn for the ailment was a 7. I didn't recognize Damien at first, as he was bundled up against the rain. His hood hid his face, and it took him a few tries to get it down out of the way as he gingerly tried to push it back with his hands. Once I realized who it was, though, I moved over to him and carefully pushed the hood back for him to help. Thank you. Damien sounded pained, and my first instinct was that his magnetic thumb had returned. Sieg hung back near the fire, seemed content to watch for the time, now that it was clear no one dangerous had wandered in. Is it another knife? Did it cut this time? I asked as I pushed Damien's coat sleeves back to get a look at his hand. Rather than finding the expected cutlery, though, I saw deep burn marks on his palms that were blistering terribly. I've been trying to bake some pastries for Mom to sell alongside the fish, and I wasn't paying attention. I tried to find Doc, but he wasn't at the tower today, and I knew it might be faster just to come out to you. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. I tisked at Damien for the suggestion as I took his elbow and pulled him inside to sit at the table. I gave Sieg an expectant look as he stood off to the side and glanced towards the icebox pointedly when he stared back blankly. He jumped as he realized what I was needing and moved to grab a clean bowl from the stack on the shelf. I should be able to get something for this made up quickly that will ease the blistering and pain. It should help it heal up without much scarring as well, but for now, put your hands in here. It will help. I rolled Damien's sleeves up for him, able to see the pain etched on his face, though he was doing a commendable job at trying to hide it. I reached a hand out expectantly, and Sieg didn't disappoint as he handed me a bowl of ice water he'd prepared. I told him thank you as I tested just to make sure it wasn't so cold it'd cause a different sort of damage, before letting Damien dunk his hands into it. I'll be back as fast as I can. C will stay here with you in the meantime, all right? High Rannoc, case number 7, Damien, a local, suffering from baker's burns. This can be treated with reagents that treat pain and burn. I grabbed my cloak and satchel before I stepped out to leave. I pulled my hood up as I stood out on the porch and the rain drizzled down. Briar was tucked under an eave and I called to her apologetically. Do you think you can get more moon lotus for us? I asked. I had the batch that hung by the door that she'd first brought to me, but I couldn't bring myself to part with it. I hoped she wouldn't mind and was relieved when she nuzzled against my shoulder before turning off to head to wherever she knew she could find the flowers. It would be my task to find the other ingredient I would need. Fortunately, I knew where to find some from the last time I'd needed to gather it specifically for Damien. Unfortunately, it meant hiking through the rain up to the old runestone, hopefully without slipping the entire way with the mud from how saturated the ground was. Moonbreaker Mountain. Event card drawn was a queen. I tried to hike up the trail as fast as I could despite the rain. The trail was practically a mud pit this time with all the rain we'd received the last couple of days. My feet sunk down into it, and I could feel it suck at my boots when I took each step. At the same time, the wrong step would send me slipping, and I'd have to steady myself. The rain started to come down harder on top of it all, and I cursed under my breath. It was fortunate I didn't have a specific time limit to help Damien, aside from not wanting to leave him suffering for long. If I had needed to rush against the clock, it would have made things even more impossible. I squinted as I looked ahead, and I thought I saw the Wayfarer's Stone just a little further up the trail. I picked up my pace and regretted it almost instantly as I felt my foot slip out from underneath me. I scrambled for a few moments, fighting to keep from completely face-planting. I thought I'd been lucky enough to catch myself on the rune-covered surface of the Wayfarer's Stone when I caught myself on a hard surface. But when I felt steady enough to look up, I found Folly looking down at me gently. Careful. His deep voice was a rumble through the rain that almost could be mistaken for thunder. I thanked him as I straightened myself out and made sure I had my footing. I looked around to orient where I was and found that the runestone was still a ways up the path from us. You're awfully far down the mountain today, Folly. Is everything all right? I looked up as Folly shielded me from the rain with his large hand, reminiscent of sitting under the ledge with him that first time when he'd given me the book. The peak is full of fog, and I needed to gather some food, so I decided to come down. Are you out to help heal someone, little witch? I nodded towards the runestone to indicate that was the direction I was heading, and Folly moved with me as he spoke. I took careful steps this time as I walked, as I didn't want to risk another near fall. I am. I just need some hiker's helper, and I know there's some up here. I finished the book you gave me last time. We both stopped when we reached the Wayfarer's Stone and the familiar spread of hiker's helper that grew around it. Folly crouched down, so he was closer to my level as I gathered, his larger form helping to shield me still from the rain. Oh, and what did you think? I could hear the curiosity in his voice as I gathered, and I tried to summarize my thoughts. That assumed the story took place in the area and that Leary had felt the same way. I looked up at Folly to gauge his reaction and saw his soft, encouraging expression as if hoping I'd go on. I don't know what it means, though, if it means anything in regards to Leary's disappearance. You sound like her. She loved that book and trying to understand if it held any truth. Folly stopped here, and even though I gave him an encouraging look to go on, he just stopped. It was like the times before, how it seemed those who knew Leary wouldn't or couldn't speak of her. You must need to get back to your patient. You should not let me keep you. I wanted to protest. I stood far longer in the rain, looking up at Folly, trying to figure out just why I felt even getting this much was a difficulty. Something wasn't piecing together correctly, but he was right. I knew I should get back and not leave Damien suffering from his burns for longer than was necessary. I said my farewells to Folly, but made mention of finding him later in the week. He stated that he would look forward to when we spoke next and seemed to linger beside the Wayfarer's Stone for a while as I headed back with the hiker's helper. When I reached the house, mind preoccupied with far too many things, I found Briar waiting for me near the porch. She had set down the moon lotus she'd brought and greeted me with a gentle headbutt as I retrieved it from the railing. Ran my hand down along her neck in thanks, and handed her some of the sweet oats I'd gotten just for her in return. When I stepped inside, I found Sieg and Damien talking in an animated and good-hearted manner, as if they were now long-time friends. It was a relief to see that Damien was distracted from his pain, and I mouthed a silent thank you to Sieg as I moved to start making the ointment needed. Burn ointment. Ingredients: moon lotus pollen times 1 raw, hiker's helper times 1 boiled. Step 1. Place hiker's helper in cauldron with half cup of water. Place over fire and bring to a boil. Pull back from heat so that it simmers for 10 to 15 minutes, long enough to thicken. Step 2. Carefully remove the stamen of the moon lotus flowers and extract the pollen into a receptacle. Step 3. Once hiker's helper has thickened into a gravy-like consistency, remove from heat entirely and scoop out the dredges of the leaves, keeping the thickened liquid. Allow to cool until it is just warm to the touch. Step 4. Carefully mix in the moon lotus pollen to the now cooled liquid. It will further thicken into a paste. Finished ointment should be a soft yellow color that glows a soft blue in the dark, similar to the moon lotus itself. Step 5. Apply the ointment to the burn gently. Blisters, when possible, should not be popped, though if they have started to crack on their own or already been popped, the ointment is still safe to use. Step 6. Once the area is entirely covered with ointment, gently wrap with clean, dry gauze to help protect the skin. Step 7. Ointment can be reapplied up to 3 times a day until burns have healed. Severity of the burns will determine how long treatment will be needed. By the time I was putting the ointment on Damien's burned hands and bandaging them, the small house was filled with laughter. It felt like I was home, truly home, for the first time in a long time. I knew it was in large part because of Sieg, who kept Damien distracted from his pain with stories of his travels. He slipped in a few stories of when we had traveled together as well, spun things in a way that made him sound like some grand hero just so that I could interject and teasingly correct him. Damien talked about some of the gossip in town, including the fact that several people were now greatly amused by Sean's apparent tall tales. It seemed that him rescuing me from Hero's Hollow wasn't the first time he'd twisted a story in his favor. By the time I was done, I was able to send Damien in much higher spirits on his way back home, with the ointment to continue treating his burns, and a lull in the rain to hopefully manage to stay dry along the way. I sat as Sieg insisted on cooking some food and watched him. I wondered how much longer he would stay. It felt unfair to think he'd stay until I figured the whole mystery out. He was like me, preferred to wander. And I couldn't forget that he'd left before. And I ended on doing my best to enjoy the time he was here for, a friendly and familiar face. May 4th. The rain finally passed, though this is the first day I would say it hasn't been dreary still. It had made it difficult to do much aside from some of the neglected chores around the house. Sieg helped off and on with these depending on his interest level, and it at least made the time go by quicker. Now that things were drying out some though, with the hint of the sun coming out, I had decided I wanted to investigate further. I wanted to try and talk to one of the four who so far seemed like they would have known Leary the best. Folly, Emerus, Follix, and Calum. Folly and Emerus would be the most difficult ones to find simply due to the fact that, though I knew where they tended to frequent, I didn't actually know specifically where they lived. For Follix, I had a good idea, though I hadn't tried to find his house yet. He'd given me a decent description that first evening we'd met, but I'd neglected so far in trying to pay him a visit. Calum would be the easiest to find, of course, and I wanted to keep that in my back pocket if I had no luck with the others. With him living in town, he'd be someone I could track down with ease when I wanted to talk with him next. Today, I wanted to try and find Follix. I aimed to try at the lock first, as it should be on the way. Sieg asked if I wanted him to come along, and I seriously considered it for a few moments. He was more outgoing and charming than I am, had on more than one occasion gotten information out of people that they clearly had no intent to share in the past. But I had gotten along with Follix previously, and I didn't want to potentially cross some unknown boundary accidentally by bringing someone unfamiliar to his house for the first time. Meltwater Lock. As I walked down to the shore of the loch, a now familiar sight, I spotted the falcon nest that I'd come across that first trip. It was clearly abandoned now, and I felt bad thinking back on the doomed bird from that day. I wished on some level that I had maybe left its nest alone. It may not have changed anything, but it may have altered something. I approached the nest to try and peek inside now, to see if there were any signs of eggs. I knew I'd feel even guiltier if there were. I scaled carefully up the side, careful of the dentist crabs that still crawled around the area with their stalk eyes at attention, and looked inside. Card drawn. Queen. I felt my stomach plunge at first when I saw the round shape within the nest, but it eased as I realized I was looking at another dentist crab when it shifted its eye stalks at me. I gave it a glare before snagging it in place in my satchel while giving a small, hopeful sort of prayer that I'd get to keep it for longer than a few minutes this time. I climbed back down the tree, this time having to avoid the pinch of a couple of the crab's claws as they seemed offended I'd taken one of their brethren, and I headed on my way. Event card drawn next. A king. I started down along the shore towards where it cut southeast a little ways. There was a trail further down this way that would cut down to High Rannoc that lay directly south of that section, just short before where south of that section of short just before the turn in the lock that carried it out of sight. Follix's house would be a little ways off this path to the west, not too far from the shore if I remembered what he'd said. I spotted the trailhead fairly easily and started towards it, skimmed my boots and the edge of the water a little in my eagerness to cut corners. I thought I had stepped too far in when my boots sank deeper into the water a moment later, only to realize that it was the water that had rose up to meet me instead. It felt as if I was reliving that first week now, only this time there was no falcon to pull Boss Batah's attention as I watched the form of the sea beast funnel towards me in the water. I backed away from the water's edge, certain I could outrun it. I couldn't outrun it, as its head burst into view, and as let out an earth-shattering roar. The scent of decay and rot hit me, even from the distance as its breath washed over me. I stood nailed to the spot with its mouth gaping in front of me as it reared up to hover over like a snake waiting to strike. Feels silly now to write, but I had the thought of whether it would be able to get itself back out into the center of the lock when it was done with me. I also noticed the source of the scent of rot. A tooth, one of its incisors, was shattered and the fragmented pieces still hung in its swollen gums. My sense of self-preservation, wondrous as ever, found me thinking of how much it would take to cure it. Stood there as the beast hung over me, ready to make me its next meal. It was only when Briar came crashing out of the brush, screeching a challenge in that way only elks can truly do, that I snapped out of it. Her charge seemed to be enough to startle Boss Batah as well. The beast pulled back and gave a roar as it slithered back into the water as she slashed with her hoofs. Suddenly aware of the danger Briar was putting herself in, I managed to get up in front of her to stop her from going further, from trying to chase the sea beast clear into the depths. This seemed to be enough to get her to ease back, though my heart pounded in my chest as I glanced back to make certain Boss Batah wasn't returning for a full assault. The beast was further back in the lock, but still far too close for comfort. Head rested just above the water in a way only its eyes were visible, so it could almost be mistaken for a giant log floating out there on the surface. Briar took a hold of my sleeve and started to pull me away from the shoreline. I followed with no resistance, though I directed us towards the trailhead that led towards town and hopefully Follix. Glimmerwood Grove. Event card drawn, a 4. Briar let me go, only once the lock was out of sight and we could no longer feel the watchful eyes of Boss Batah on us. She still clung close to my side as we walked. I wondered how long she had been following me, if she made it a habit of doing so even when I believed I had left her behind at the house. I was thankful for it at that moment. I watched for signs of a path that branched off our current one as we went. It wouldn't be too far down the trail from its beginning, and as we rounded a corner, I spotted it. It wasn't a well-marked It wasn't a well-marked trail, but it was still a certain one that cut through the grass that grew up between the trees. Short way down it, I even saw a small handmade sign that had Volix's name on it that gave me comfort that we were on the right track. The trees here were still thick, but of a different kind whose canopy wasn't quite as thick. It seemed to allow for a lot of undergrowth, and grasses and bushes sprung up around us. The ground was damp as well, likely due to the proximity to the loch and some of the rivers and streams that ran off of it, and I could spot along little alcoves mushrooms growing in their little niches. I stopped to admire one, an edible variety that didn't have much in medicinal value but did contribute heavily to flavor, and I decided it wouldn't hurt to harvest one to add to a dish. As I stood, I heard a shout that sounded angry, and I looked up in alarm as I felt something hit me in the shoulder. It would have likely gone above me if I hadn't stood up at just the right time, but that apparently wasn't my luck. I thought something had just been thrown at me, so I was confused by Briar's panicked stamping as she moved between me and the unfamiliar dwarf that was a short distance away. I heard the sound of Frolic shouting next, as I still tried to piece together just what was going on, and as I looked down, I saw red staining my shirt. I still didn't really understand, even as I pulled the arrow out of my shoulder. It was likely the shock. Combination of adrenaline of my run-in with Boss Bata piled on top of the unexpected hit I'd taken. Folix appeared beside me, cursing up a storm at the other dwarf, who was arguing that it was my fault for standing up when it was just supposed to be a warning shot. Briar reared up, clearly ready to trample one or both of the dwarfs, and I had to reach out to try to calm her, to explain that clearly this was a misunderstanding or something of the like. With the movement to reach up and try to pet her flank to calm her, the pain started to set in. At first it was a low throb, but then a sharp one with every movement. Don't move it too much until we know the damage. Come now, Marcius. Let's get you inside and cleaned up. Goddamn idiot brother of mine. Sterling, what have I told you about taking pot shots at people? Volix made sounds of reassurance to Briar as he helped me calm her down, though she still seemed heavily tempted to trample his brother when he came close. Volix motioned for him to hang back before putting an arm gently around me to herd me down the path. The pain was more and more apparent with each movement, and I knew the arrow had gone deeper than I realized. I should have left it in place rather than pull it out until I could have had the chance to fully assess just what damage it had done. It is too late to do that at any rate, so I did my best to keep my right arm still as we walked. The small cottage that was almost blended into the hillside came into view a short while later. Folix's house was sturdy and well hidden in the forest, as if to ensure that it wouldn't be stumbled upon by accident. I'd say you should have told me you were coming, so I could have kept my brother from shooting you, but I suppose there wasn't much of a way for you to do that. Folix joked to try and lighten the mood as he opened the door to show me inside. I gave him the best smile I could muster before I had to turn and tell Briar to wait outside when she tried to fully follow us into the house. Sorry, she is protective, and we've already had a run-in with Boss Bata today. You may want your brother to come inside so she doesn't decide to kick him in the head when no one's looking. I tried my own joke. Felt it was a little flat, but Follock still laughed heartily at it before calling for Sterling to come inside and be of use. So I did something a little different here, since I was going to have a conversation in an attempt to get information about the previous witch, Leary. So I was going to allow myself 5 tries in the conversation to pull a Joker. Attempt number 1 for Joker. I ended up pulling it this time, so pass. So then the clue card I drew was a 7. And I'm going to be doing that in the next few weeks because there's going to be some other conversations coming up in the next few weeks. Follock doted on me and ordered his brother around, all while he helped assess and dress my wound. Sterling cursed up a storm, but seemed somehow apologetic through it all, as he explained that he thought it was some truffle-stealing asshole who had coming around their house to over-harvest and leave them almost nothing. I did admit to taking one of the mushrooms I had found, but Follox waved this off. You're a friend, and one mushroom is hardly worth an arrow. Though, if we do catch the one who's been coming and making entire patches disappear, they may rightfully deserve it if Sterling fires one off. Through all this, I almost forgot the point of me making the trip out to visit Follox, but I spotted a narwhal banner pinned to his wall that made me suddenly realize. Oh, I wanted to ask more about Leary. I blurted it out with a far less grace and tact than was proper, as Follox finished pouring me a warm cup of ale to help with the pain. He startled a little at my exclamation, spilled some of the ale, but quickly recovered. I noticed that Sterling, who now sat at the table with his own mug, watched Follox with a steady gaze, as I dug through my satchel and produced the small piece of the banner I'd found so long back now. Leary's handwriting on the bottom corner simply said, "Fight." Part of some longer epitaph had been my best guess. I handed the torn piece to Follox, who looked at it silently, held it carefully in his hands, as if it was something delicate and precious. I still feel like I haven't learned anything about what might have happened to her. I was just hoping maybe you'd at least be able to tell me more about her. I asked the question gently, a little more control of my tone as I watched him. It was that same sad look of loss that I had seen so many times now. I had seen it from Folly and Emrys when I'd asked about Leary. All 3 of them had that same sad look, but none of them seemed willing to tell me more about her. Sterling stood up slowly, moved over to a wall where a lute leaned and picked it up. I watched as he sat down in a nearby chair and started to sing a tune I'd not heard before, or at least, I don't think I have, but there's something that felt familiar about it. I've marked down what I remember of the lyrics here. Don't speak, dear friends, of the end of ends, for we shall all live on beneath the moon-drenched sky. For the moon sees all, even where the shadows fall, and we'll dance on in the night. Don't fear the stars, for they'll lead us all to the truth buried deep below. For the moon sees all, even where shadows fall, and soon she'll see you too, and the sun will dry the earth and sky from the tears of Shaladin. There was a long pause when Sterling finished singing, where we sat in silence. I was certain that Follox was crying, but it felt intrusive to look close enough to tell in the firelight of the room. Well, that was her favorite. There's more to it, but damned if I remember it honestly. Some bards sang it in a local tavern once, and Larry wouldn't stop humming it all around. Sterling spoke as he stood up to set the lute back in place. Larry had a way of clinging on to things, bits of tales that she heard. Always wanted to dig further into them. History stuff mostly, I suppose. Follix finally spoke up, voice a little broken, but he seemed to have pulled himself together. There was still that sense of silent sadness clinging to him as he stood up and took the piece of banner. Do you know if she was digging into something specific around the time went missing? Afraid not. If she was, it wasn't something I knew about. Follix shook his head. I watched as he pinned it in place next to his full banner. I could tell it must have been the same design as what Larry's banner originally had been, from how clearly the torn piece matched up with the bottom corner of Follix's banner. I let the conversation stray away from Larry then, though I watched the two brothers closely. I felt like there was something more that Follix wanted to say, but if there was, he never said it. After some time had passed, he instead suggested I head home, both so I could get some rest due to my injury, and also as the two of them had some things they needed to get done before the end of the day. As I left, Sterling apologized again for getting me with what he still swore had been intended as a warning shot only. He seemed mildly worried I'd curse him, but I reassured him it was forgiven. I felt like he'd try to give me something with the song, though. What was just another puzzle I'd have to decipher. Follix stood on their porch and watched as Briar and I walked down the trail. It felt oddly like being watched by Boss Patah, as we had left the lock earlier, though I couldn't for a second sense out any malicious intent from Follix. It was more the keen eye of a sentry who watched for some advanced sign of danger. Partway back, Briar stopped and stubbornly refused to move until I carefully used a tree stump to climb up onto her back. I wasn't certain she'd be able to carry me, but once I sat in place, I could tell how foolish of a worry that was. She felt like the sturdiest of pack horses I'd ridden in the past. It was a relief to be off my feet. I didn't honestly realize how much the day and my injury had worn on me until then. By the time we reached the house, I felt as if I could have passed out on the spot. Find out anything? Sieg asked the second I stepped into the door, but the curious look on his face immediately dropped when he saw me. He rushed to me, fret and worry clear on his features, as he asked what happened. I assured him I was fine and that it had been an accident, but he seemed far from willing to accept this. Still, he helped me back to my room and insisted I get rest immediately. I was wishing I had something to ease the pain in my shoulder again, the ride back home and the ale having worn off some by that time. Sieg brought me some water and a bit of wine as our best option on hand. Once he was certain I wasn't in dire straits, at least, I convinced him that I simply needed some rest. As I drifted off, I was aware that he'd left my door open a crack, as though to make it easier to hear me if I called out, Marcius. Alright, and that is it for this week. We did successfully cure Damien, so our reputation is officially up to 10. We get 20 more silver, so we are back up to 75. And we did not really get anything new inventory wise, so we are all still the same there. And so we will be picking up from here next week. And yeah, so the gameplay with drawing the jokers during the conversation, that was something I just kind of implemented because I needed some way to justify speaking with people I've established as having known Leary and trying to determine whether they were going to give information or not. So, since we are kind of moving into that section of the game, I kind of created that rule of during those specific set-aside conversations, I'm going to do that where I try to draw the Joker during those conversations. It was just a stroke of luck that I managed to get a Joker first try this time. And then if you couldn't quite tell, what we learned was Leary's favorite song. And whether that holds any clues for us, we will see. So, thank you to anyone who stopped by.